Oi oi, it's your boy, the Knee Reaper of Aleppo, Jack Slack, and this is the Jack Slack Podcast, Episode 2, the gritty reboot of the Fights Gone By podcast, and we're coming at you in the middle of the week because, I'm living in lockdown and it's just made things a little bit complicated. Please do bear with me. Basically, the wife is also working here throughout the day on calls, and I can't really justify, telling her to shut up for the duration of me recording the podcast. So I'm doing this now on a Wednesday evening, hopefully to get it out the same night. But we've got tons to talk about. Dana White's going to personally catch and imprison every person who pirates the upcoming McGregor-Poirier pay-per-view. Cyril Gane versus Jairzinho Rozenstruik got booked. Maybe my best fight at heavyweight. You could do Ngannou versus Gane, but it's two big European chaps. That will piss off a certain segment of my listenership. Two big European chaps who are going to throw hillbilly haymakers at each other. And, Gane's probably the more polished striker. You would hope he doesn't run onto, the short counter left hook / counter jab that Jairzinho Rozenstruik has used in basically all of his fights. And Andrei Arlovski knew he was going to do and still ran face first onto twice. But yeah, that's a hell of an announcement. There's been a few more, but I thought we'd kick things off today with one of two reading series that I want to cover. So we're going to do a happy one and then a sad one, and I'll let you guess which one's which. We're starting with an amazing piece which went up on Sherdog, which I'm sure you can find, but just at the end of the year, it was like a last-minute entry for worst hatchet job in MMA that year. We all write bad articles. We all write things that we then go, oh, I wish I hadn't written that and put it on the internet. But this was just one of the thesis, the idea behind this, the central driving sentiment was just so confused that I took notice. And partly because Michael Bisping just dragged it on Twitter. But this was the talk of the MMA world for a few days afterwards. And it's an article called Opinion, Michael Bisping, Entitled and Arrogant. Now, I know what you're thinking. Not a lie so far. But this really reads like Darren Wynn's mum got on the computer and wrote the article. It's very, very strange. Basically, if you didn't see Darren Wynn's fight when was that? A few weeks ago. It wasn't great. Darren Wynn's fights are rarely great. He is too short for his division, but still coming in heavy. And then he has to try and take guys down without getting beaten up on the feet. He eats knees just for breakfast. And then once he's on top, he doesn't really do a lot with it. And he quipped during the fight, Michael Bisping quipped on commentary during the fight to DC, do you not have any treadmills at AKA? And this dude got really mad about it. Darren Wynn got mad about it, and they had a little tweet exchange. And to take over to the article now, which is where Bisping comes in. Being one of the commentators, he was the most vocal in sharing his disapproval of the fight in round 3, flat out insulting both combatants' fitness. In a vacuum that would be acceptable, commentators are allowed to criticise what they're watching, even when they are meant to promote the product. In Bisping's case, however, it was all quite disingenuous. To begin with, Bisping is easily the worst commentator for any major MMA promotion. Stop there. Come out of the quotation. What the fuck? It's not even the worst UFC commentator. They got Brendan Fitzgerald on there, usually with him. But more importantly, has this man never watched a Bellator event? He continues, part of this may not be his fault. He is blind in one eye and has had problems with the other. So in many instances, it is possible that he isn't even seeing what's occurring in the cage and thus gets his description wrong. But part of this is his own incompetence. He is immensely lazy, ignoring what is actually going on in the fight in favour of simplistic, often false narratives to which he clings like a paddle in a shipwreck. He will fall over himself praising the abilities of the least skilled, least experienced fighters on the roster, those who would have no chance of competing in the UFC before the promotion's desperate need to fulfill 42 events per year. He does so in a transparently fake, buffoonish manner. I don't even know how. Give us an example, mate. Thus, for Bisping to suddenly find his honesty and become critical when commenting on Wynn and Arroyo, both of them far better combatants than many that he has praised, leaves a sour taste. He continues to just tell Bisping off and says, clapping back on this tweet was actually the worst thing he could have done. He should have let Darren Wynn have a win by not responding to his tweet. But this is where it gets better. The guy has admitted in the first couple of paragraphs that the whole reason that the fight was crap was because Wynn gassed out and so did Arroyo. And then he just goes off the deep end here. We often talk about a fighter's toughness and courage when they're involved in a brutal war of attrition, taking heavy damage. But what about when they're fighting for their livelihood? At that moment, Wynn wasn't thinking about being entertaining or about impressing Dana White and satisfying his love of sloppy firefights while avoiding his hatred of grappling. He was thinking only about keeping his career afloat. He was a desperate man. And given that he was getting beaten up in the striking, the best way to do that was in a wrestling contest. No mention of the fact that it's always in a wrestling contest because he has a foot reach disadvantage against everyone he fights and his striking isn't good. It wasn't pretty, but Wynn showed the grit and toughness of a true warrior in one of the most stressful, difficult situations imaginable. Bisping can't relate to this. He has no understanding or appreciation of a fighter making close to UFC minimum, fighting for his career. Why should he? He hasn't had to worry about being cut since Season 3 of The Ultimate Fighter in 2006 and subsequently became good friends with the boss. He has made a lot of money across his professional fighting career, including headlining a major pay-per-view against a returning George St. Pierre, and now has a six-figure commentator job, source please, with the company, despite how dreadful he is at it. Hell, it was recently announced that he would star in a Hollywood film about boxing. He is comfortable, secure and wealthy, while Wynn isn't. Respond... And then it continues on like that. But the man is saying that Michael Bisping, who is telling Darren Wynn off for not having cardio, and Arroyo, and saying that he never faced hardship. The man lost his eye in the cage and had to bluff his way past doctors to get approved to fight. The more you see of him post-fight and him taking off his fake lens and stuff, the more you realise that he probably shouldn't have been fighting, even when he won the title. Much like Harry Greb, he had a fake eye. He had a glass eye for most of his career, and the doctors didn't know. And then when they found out, he told people in his retirement, and they immediately cracked down on eyesight in boxers for the next 5 years. Castamato said that that's the reason that he never fought professionally while his brother did. But at any rate, Michael Bisping has taken some absolute arse kickings in the cage. The thing that he's known for, there's two things he's known for: being a bit of a knobhead, and also for taking a ton of punishment and coming back. Think of any of his most famous fights, and you either think of him getting knocked out, beating someone he shouldn't, or taking a kicking and then coming back to win. And ironically, one of the ways that he did it was by having great cardio. I feel like if Michael Bisping is qualified to comment on anything... Oh, and by the way, he lived in his car for a long time. He lived in a car with his wife, who, his now wife, I believe. They're still together. And competed in this sport at a time when there was no money to be had at all. There was no money to be had a lot of the time when he was in the UFC, which we'll get to later in our next reading series. But it's just so strange. There is no one more qualified to comment on how important it is to have some fucking cardio than a man who came from nothing in a sport that had no prospects and made his money because he had cardio and developed cardio and kept his cardio on top form. Just a bizarre... I recommend you go read this because it's absolutely batshit. And I won't blame the writer. We've all been angry about the results of fights or just not liked one of the commentators. But just how out of touch do you have to be to go, well, Bisping's never faced any adversity. So Michael Bisping, Entitled and Arrogant. Go read it. But we got some fights coming up this weekend and they look to be pretty good. In fact, this is the start of 3 successive events. I was going to say fight nights, but the last one's a pay-per-view. We got this one, we got the one on Wednesday, which is going to throw me right off. I love a Wednesday fight card, but it does throw me off my timings, off my game. It keeps me, it's a right-hand lead, and I'm expecting just a diet of jabs. But this weekend, we got Maxi Holloway versus Calvin Kattar, and some other interesting fights on that card. Now, I haven't written anything about this fight, so I'll just go full in-depth on it here as much as I'm thinking about it. But Kattar versus Holloway, lovely, lovely matchup. I mean, you can't do anything bad in that division, to be honest. Just going to pull up the UFC rankings for featherweight. And yeah, I mean, featherweight, one of the things about it was that it used to be like Wrestler City, which was why it was a bit weird that Conor McGregor got all the way to a title shot without ever facing a wrestler. And part of, that in turn was part of why it was impressive that he stepped in on he took the Chad Mendes fight on short notice, because it seemed like up to that point, the brass were desperate to keep him away from wrestlers. Because, I mean, I'm not saying these names are not going to sound too great now because we're years removed and McGregor's still good and these guys have fallen off. But you had like the Clay Guidas, the Darren Elkinses, people like that. What's his name? Hakran Diaz. There's all these guys who are Ricardo Lamas, people like that. Lots of really strong wrestlers in that division. Obviously Frankie. And he somehow just dodged through the rankings even though they were smattered all through it. But nowadays, like the division is basically Striker City. And they were talking about this on I think it might have been the most recent Heavy Hands or the one before, but they were just saying that the featherweight division is the Striker's delight, and it really is. You got Volkanovski as champ, obviously can do it all, but very skilled as a kickboxer. Holloway, obviously known almost entirely as a striker, but great takedown defense. Brian Ortega, known as a grappler, but like 0 for 8 in takedowns in the UFC, so definitely not a wrestler. Zabi is a wrestler, but again makes most of his money with his striking. Yair, again, striker. Chanson Jung, striker, with grappling stuff too. But, when you look down this, like, Calvin Kattar, Josh Emmett is a wrestler again, but, like, makes his money with his hands. Jeremy Stevens is, Arnold Allen, where the fuck's he been? And then Sadiq Youssef. So, all that top 10, striker. But, if you look at that division, this is probably two of the best jabbers in the division, but probably two of the best jabbers in the sport meeting up. And I was starting to write something about I was starting to write a Filthy Casuals guide, but I just couldn't get it together. But I was talking about how both of them have a performance where they just got stumped by low kicks because they are, we used to complain about there being no jabbing in the UFC at all, or in MMA rather. And now you've got guys like Holloway and Kattar who use their jab wonderfully. They float in with it. They have that long bladed stance when they do it. They follow up in combination. They can get their feet in afterwards. But they always go in with that foot first. Because you can't, like, you can jab with your feet with a narrow stance. Or a short stance rather. You can jab straight out of the stance. You can have your jab go further than your legs, like not extend your stance out. But those are not, that's like a sub-type of jab. That's not, most good boxing jabbing has you going into a longer stance to do it or being in a longer stance to start with. And in that longer, more side-on stance or bladed stance, you are incredibly susceptible to the low kick. If you watch someone like Riddick Bowe, amazing jabber in boxing, he took a Muay Thai fight at the age of like 50. So it's not, I'm not saying, it's to demonstrate a point. I'm not saying like Riddick Bowe was in his prime when this happened, but he came out for this Muay Thai fight and he stood like side on, like he would for a boxing match. He, in position to just snap the hand out for the jab, just put the foot in a little bit, almost side on. And the guy just kicked the shit out of his lead leg because it's in such a compromised position. And there are some guys in MMA who fight like that, like BJ Penn's answer to low kicks was to pretend that they weren't there and then hope that his offense overwhelmed the other guy. And for a very long time it did. Sip of tea, sorry. But Holloway against Volkanovski the first time and Kattar versus Moicano, both of them had that problem where the opponent worked out that they want to come in with the jab and then start building off it. And they backed up, let them step in, made a little bit of space, low kicked. And the way that it worked, when we talk about angles, a lot of the time we're talking about like moving to a different angle on the opponent, but the angles, like how close you are and far you are, change the angle of like a circular strike. If you're in on top of someone and you step in with like a right hand or a jab and you're too close and the opponent throws a low kick, the angle of it is going to mean that your blow lands up the center and their kick is sort of like round the side of you. Whereas if you've got the distance behind you to make that to like slide back and make sure that they're right on the end of your kick, their knee, you've got a much better chance of buckling it in and them not being able to get in with a follow up. Like the slow mo low kicks that they showed from Volkanovski Holloway 1. If you go watch those, they show them between the rounds, but they show them at the end of the fight too. There's a couple of really good instances where Max moves in, like just sort of poking the jab out there to like he does to make ground, double jabbing in, which is something that almost no one does and should do, but also be aware of this. But he comes in double jabbing and Holloway and Volkanovski kicks him in the knee or in the thigh just above the knee and buckles it in, and it looks like Holloway should be able to chase him back, and his he should be able to get in with a punch quicker than Volkanovski can get his foot back to the floor and get away. But it doesn't work like that because his knee's been buckled across himself. It's very hard to throw a good right hand if your lead knee is pointing, towards that direction that your hand's coming from, and you're stumbling. It's about the worst time you can get hit with the low kick. Like if you watch the rematch between Volkanovski and Holloway, which we gave Game Plan of the Year, I watched it again yesterday. Fantastic fight, but Max doesn't get away from all the low kicks, but because the numbers aren't that aren't... The numbers don't say that he was, like, getting away from the low kicks. He takes a lot of low kicks, but he's in a much better position when he takes them. He doesn't take so many when he's stepping in, and you don't see his knee buckle in and him fall off balance a lot. It's more him up in that short stance, and Volkanovski will do like a step up inside low kick. And, he reddens up his thighs and stuff, but he's not buckling his knee and breaking his stance and getting away scot-free. A lot of the time, Holloway's actually able to come back on Volkanovski's low kicks because of it. But Holloway's answer to it in the first fight was to switch to southpaw just because he didn't really know what to do. Kattar hasn't had a rematch with Moicano, and he hasn't really fought anyone who's going to slide back and low kick. Zabit threw a few low kicks, timed him coming in a couple of times with the inside low kick and knocked his lead leg out, but it wasn't so much a factor there. So we can't really see how he's how he's going to deal with that game plan. But what he tried to do was like invent a way of punching without putting his foot in, which, they haven't managed it in 400 years of boxing. It's hard to do it on the fly. If you watch that fight, there's some really weird shots of him like trying to basically like front crawl, but through the air in front of him. Do you call it front crawl over there? Freestyle, whatever the swimming stroke is. But that's to say, like, neither of these guys is crap at checking low kicks, and I think that's what a lot of people took away from those fights. The problem was that the low kick was a counter to a specific step that they kept doing. If you watch, like, Kattar has before then and since then fought guys who just low kick at him normally, like from striking position, and he's had no trouble at all. It's being caught stepping in on heavy on that leg and trying to jab that really does the damage. But I think this is a really interesting one because you've got sort of a matchup of jabs, and both men have also had people jab against them successfully. Like Volkanovski got himself back into that second fight with his jab. He was shorter than Max, punching up at him. I know that Max has got a shorter reach than Volkanovski, actually, but if you're punching up like a good amount, you're losing a lot of that reach in practice. Your reach is at its most. Like, put your arm out in front of your shoulder, that's where your reach is the most. Where your reach will reach forward the most, that is. You point it up or down significantly and you start to lose inches off that reach. I should have said stand in front of a wall. Stand in front of a wall, put your arm out at shoulder level, and then just go up or down straight from the shoulder, and you'll see. But yeah, Volkanovski got himself back into that fight by jabbing. Zabit did jab eat pretty well against Kattar in their fight. Honestly, I watched that fight again today, and as someone who was bored to death of people being like, Zabit is the next world champion, and me being like, he gasses in 7 minutes every time, I was actually really loving that fight. He's a really fun fighter to watch. And that's probably like the best striker he's met in the cage. And it was a good back and forth fight. I remembered it as like people thinking that Zabit dominated the first 2 rounds and then gassed in the third, but I thought it was a very good, close, competitive fight through the first 2, and then the third was a lot more Kattar-y. But what Zabit was able to do was jab with him, slip his head to the outside of Kattar's jab and jab with him. Or also, when he moved in, Kattar's response was not to jab, but to do like a long guard over the shoulder. So put your arm out straight and your other arm up, like either on the side of your head or folding across with your elbow in front of your face. I just did that and blocked myself out from the microphone. A long guard. Look it up. And in doing that, Zabit was able to move in with a dipping jab or a slipping jab, whatever you want to call it, and then come in with body shots. So it was weird because Zabit's a very tall man for the division, but he was using the jab to close and use like inside boxing. So very peculiar. But an opening that's there, and I really, watching that fight, I was going, oh, that's something Max could use. Because Max, so good. One of the reasons that I loved him from back in like the Bermudez fight is that he will jab or he will fake the jab and get in to throw the left hook to the body. When he's getting to the body, he's one of the best in the game at it. So we could have a good old-fashioned jab off here. The interesting thing about like Kattar's jab versus Holloway's jab is that Holloway tends to step in with it and sort of probe with it and do that sort of double jab stuff, and pile up the volume. He likes to just go pop, pop, so almost like you're ignoring the punches so that he can just start piling them on. He's like a Diaz if Diaz's were good. But Kattar, he'll throw his jab is like an arm punch, but he throws it really hard without turning his shoulders a lot of the time. So he goes straight out. It's what some coaches call like a snap jab, but he's very strict on like not committing himself a lot of the time. If you watch the Burgos fight, where a guy's putting him under constant pressure, he's really disciplined about getting it out and back to his own head. And when it's out, his shoulders are always up by his chin. He's got a really lovely form. I mean, he's a guy I'd point to. Like, obviously, if you've got a young fighter and you're going like, how do you apply the jab in MMA? we're not far removed from people being like the jab doesn't work in MMA. Bas Rutten, who I have enormous respect for, he used to say like, don't jab in MMA, there's no point, punch hard. But then he loves Max Holloway. And I think he's since gone on to say like, he was wrong in that. But I think that's the thing with anything in MMA. Don't say don't do it because we don't really know. Like there's so much that hasn't been applied effectively in MMA, but doesn't mean that it won't be in future. It's like I haven't seen any bolos, parent bolos in MMA, but you might get one day. But if you're a young fighter coming up, like Kattar's jab is one of the best. And then Holloway for like building combinations off the jab. I think the thing about Holloway is that he's one of the most adaptable fighters in MMA as a striker. That is, there are the Frankie Edgars and people like that who can change what they're doing. But Max Holloway fought 2 competitive fights with Alexander Volkanovski as like a completely different style of striker. In the first fight, he's trying to box, and then he switches to southpaw and works from there. And so 2 different types of striker in one fight there. But in the second fight, he's suddenly Muay Thai Max. He's cut the shorts all the way up to the waistband. He's fighting from a very short stance, and he's pressuring Volkanovski to the fence, but also letting Volkanovski come off the fence. There are a couple of that was his dealing with the low kicks. He stood much shorter, and he had his lead leg pointed out towards where the kick would come from a lot of the time. So he was able to take the kicks a lot more and come back on them. But also he moved Volkanovski to the fence, and there's a couple of really good ones where he gets Volkanovski too close to the fence. Volkanovski hasn't quite clocked it yet. He moves in, Volkanovski slides back to do the low kick, but can't slide back, and then Holloway will hit him with a right hand up the centre because he's not got the distance to chop the knee inwards and get away. It reminds me of the, very similar to how he fought against Aldo, where he was fighting like, I used to say his knees were bowed out like Wyatt Earp. He's got his lead knee pointed like 45 degrees out to his left almost, and he's standing very short, and then as soon as Aldo throws his first low kick, Holloway comes back with the right hand up the centre, just to say, don't do that. But obviously a lot trickier with a guy who's going to slide back and counter kick like Volkanovski was doing. So putting him against the fence with a great shout. And then he was also doing very well on the counter, because in their first fight, Volkanovski was when Holloway went southpaw, Volkanovski wasn't able to use that outside low kick as much. So what he was doing was he'd shift in and throw the shifting right hook, which we did a Filthy Casuals guide on. But he was having to cover these long distances because even though reach similar, much shorter man. And in this rematch, Holloway, in addition to fighting shorter, is fighting taller. So Volkanovski really has to run in to get him. And he hit him with lovely counter uppercuts. And he'd fade back with a counter left hook. And he even hit him with a really nice counter knee, which was something that worked the one time he did it in the first fight. And it almost flew under the radar because he did it. But then Volkanovski stopped doing anything for the next 30 seconds. And that's always a great sign. Like, you used to see that with people like BJ Penn, the Diaz's occasionally. But just like they'd get hit in the body and they'd be like, nah. And then they'd stop. The activity would just drop off and you wouldn't know they were hurt, aside from the fact that they stopped doing what they always do. I think for this one, Max Holloway, I'd love to see him use the jab to get inside and hit the body, switch to southpaw, throw the front kick to the body. He's got a lovely front kick. Use the back kick out of orthodox stance. Take advantage of having that two stance and, having that 2 stance game and kicking, where, both of them have amazing jabs, but why would you limit yourself to just trying to jab with this guy if you know that you've got so many tools? And Kattar's really like the jab, the right hand, occasional body shots, the odd nice elbow, but really an upper body heavy fighter, and very much out of the one stance. He's good at defending himself. He keeps himself safe. Always has his chin pinned to his left to the inside of his left shoulder. But yeah, throw him different looks. Just confuse him is what I'd hope for from Holloway here. Whereas for Kattar, try and apply the jab, try and fight in the orthodox manner. Use some low kicks because he doesn't use them as much as he should, but he's got some good ones there. And look for elbows when Holloway comes in, because if you can get him going to the body, Holloway is a tall guy for the division, and when he goes to the body, he tends to do it upright. He will level change for like the rear straight to the body, so if he's in a southpaw stance, the left straight, if he's in an orthodox stance, the right straight, and he will level change for a jab to the body, but when he throws like his left hook to the body, he tends to do it down. And then we get into like open hooks versus closed hooks, shovel hooks, whatever you want to call them. But like tall guys who hit the body tend to do it with the elbow quite close in, whereas great example I tweeted this week, Morgan Charrier, who is the last pirate, great nickname. He's Cage Warriors featherweight champion at the moment, I think. But he won the title with a level change left hook with his elbow open. So he was throwing like a left hook like you would to the head with the thumb knuckle facing you rather than the fist vertical. And he threw it like that to the body, which is something George Groves used to do in boxing. Really weird punch, but worked wonderfully for him. But yes, as I was saying, Kattar should be looking for counter elbows on there. I think that would be a great idea. Honestly, either of them could benefit from engaging in like double hand checking and the hand fight, taking away the opponent's jab. I think I'd probably give Kattar the edge on power. I think that both the Zabit fight and the Burgos fight are interesting because you had two guys who were effectively getting inside the jab and flustering Kattar enormously, but then he came out the other side looking much more composed than them. He managed to he caught Burgos because Burgos just got like so comfortable wading in with his chin out and slipping the punches, and then he just didn't one time and got knocked out. But Zabit slipping inside and hitting him in the body like half a dozen times every round with good left hooks, and it's Zabit who tires out. So Kattar obviously in great condition. Is this the first time we've seen him over a 5-rounder? Because I know, you beat me to it. You're already thinking the Zabit fight was a main event, but was scheduled for 3 rounds, which plays into this whole thing of like, how much help do you need, Zabit? Like, if you're amazing for 2 rounds, you're not going to get a 3-round title fight. It's not going to happen. I mean, unless you knock him out in the first 3 rounds, which I suppose is the thinking there. But anyway, that's a terrific matchup, and I think if you're Holloway trying to not just drag him to deep waters, but try and make him work throughout the entire time. Kattar, he's done an amazing job in his harder fights, like the Burgos one and the Zabit one. He's done a great job of outlasting people. But I feel where Zabit was like, lots of wild, crazy stuff in between the good work, and Burgos was just, the same thing over and over again. I feel like Max could really wear on him with the variety. Oh no, I forgot Dan Ige. That was a 5-rounder. And I can barely remember any of it, even though it was a decent fight. Man, a good fight. Let's move on. Carlos Conde versus Matt Brown is the co-main, which is a real strange one, because I'm still... I'm quite like... I feel like both those guys should have retired already. Not just should retire, but should have retired already. And like watching Carlos Conde against Maya and Matt Brown... the Cerrone one was really sad. There's been a few, but... Even so, you put those two against each other, and I'm like, yeah, I'll watch that. That sounds great. I also cannot believe that's not already happened. Like, what? These guys were around the welterweight division at the same time, coming up the same. I don't know. I was going to say maybe they tried not to match them together to kill off one striker from the matchup, but that would just mean you had them fighting wrestlers. I really think this is a terrific matchup. I mean, Conde, while he is the natural-born killer, I would say that he hasn't looked tremendously threatening, even in like his last good performance, which was the Robbie Lawler one. He was doing that on volume and just like being active. The Court McGee fight, like he did look better, but I mean, not in any like amazing way. I get a feeling like that was one of those fights where people were so pleased that Carlos Conde didn't get hurt or beat up too badly, and they sort of went, amazing, and they got lost in the jubilation over that. Because he was on a pretty bad run, like Maya made him look bad. Magny was all over him. Then Alex Oliveira choked him in the second round, and then Chiesa was all over him and submitted him as well. Matt Brown's actually not on a bad run if you just look at the record, but like he's on a 2-1 streak. But he just got knocked out by Miguel Baeza, which is that was a strange fight to put together because Baeza was an undefeated killer, and Matt Brown was he definitely wasn't rebounding because he just fought Diego Sanchez, who, at this stage, I mean, he's saying he's going to retire now, but like we've been begging for it for almost a decade at this point. And Ben Saunders, who again, very, very long in the tooth. There's almost like 2 welterweight divisions, and these 2 guys have been competing in the old man's version, but then Matt Brown jumped back in to fight Miguel Baeza and got destroyed. If I'm being honest, I think Matt Brown's style has probably aged worse because he relies so much on that confidence and the swarming stuff. And it's hard to do that well if you've been knocked out recently. It's hard to do that well if you don't have confidence in your chin. the Robbie Lawler loss is one I always point to. Like, Robbie Lawler, I think Matt Brown at that time could have murdered Robbie Lawler if he fought like Matt Brown. But he tried to fight like Matt Brown out of the gate. Robbie Lawler loaded up on the first counter he could. And from then on, Matt Brown was like, whoa, let's have a kickboxing match. And that's not the kind of fight that he's particularly good at. So having said that, I could see, because Carlos Conde, the McGee fight was quite measured, I thought. And Conde has always been good when he's just sort of like marching in wildly. Punch, stepping with each punch, ki-eyeing with each punch, weaving his head, throwing high kicks, shit like that. He's got a very, messy striking style. He's a male Holly Holm with power, basically. But always getting taken down, with no resistance. That was Carlos Conde's thing. Having a great guard, but no takedown defense to speak of. So honestly, if he's not feeling... I think a lot of this comes down to the confidence of both, because Matt Brown, if he's going forward and he's pressuring, I can see him giving Conde a horrible time. And if Condit's not out of the gate and being wild and aggressive, I can see Matt Brown putting him on the back foot and running over him. So I think, it's weird to get too much into the feelings and emotion stuff when we're talking about technique and strategy normally, but I think it'd be very interesting to see where each man's head is at going into that. I think Conde, the thing with Conde's striking is that he relies a lot on marching combinations, and obviously those don't work if the guy's pressuring you, because you're relying on the guy going backwards with your punches. It's like Donald Cerrone used to be if you gave him ground, he would just march into low kicks and murder you. But I think that Conde could do some good work here with intercepting knees and elbows. He's always liked his elbows, but against Thiago Alves, he was throwing them all marching, which is the worst way that you could imagine to throw an elbow, lunging out in front of you. That short range technique. But I'm a massive sucker for both of these lads, so it's going to be weird, because one of them is probably going to get knocked out, and I'm going to be really sad about that, but I'm also going to be really happy to see a vintage knockout from the other one. And of course, Matt Brown, one of the things about Matt Brown is that he's always been willing to wrestle as well, whereas Carlos Conde has always been I strike, and then people take me down, and then I grapple. whereas Matt Brown has always been very willing to throw people to the mat, especially with the trips from the clinch. Absolutely beautiful stuff. But this is I can see why they put this as the co-main, but the real sort of co-main for me, my personal co-main, is Santiago Ponzinibbio versus Li Jiangliang. Bit strange for Ponzinibbio. I mean, it just shows how if you miss a beat in this division, well, it's been a long beat, but if you miss a beat, everything you've done just falls by the wayside. Because in his last one, he looked electric against Neil Magny. We all remember him poking Gunnar Nelson in the eye, but there were several times in that Magny fight where Magny's clutching his eye, thinking he's been poked in the eye, and you see the replay, and it's just a razor sharp jab. He was finding his eyeball every time with the jab, and he beat the shit out of Magny and stopped him in the fourth, which is about as... I mean, that's probably the best round to stop people, because you get to show a full fight almost of cardio and domination, and then get the stoppage as well. I'm not saying people should aim for that. I'm just saying, in terms of performances, it's always fourth or fifth round stoppages. You go, nice. But this is where things get odd, because Neil Magny's last opponent was Li Jiangliang. So basically, Ponzinibbio comes back. If he beats the Leech, all he's done is give him a second loss in a row and not really move forward in the division. And he's been removed from the rankings due to inactivity, which is fair enough. He had something really... Was he a blood infection or something like that? He had a bad one. Or it might have been super bad stuff, but his was pretty alarming when I heard about it. Which explains the long time off. Bit hilarious that Santiago Ponzinibbio is not ranked as a welterweight, but Conor McGregor is ranked number 15 at welterweight on the UFC's official rankings. Xing Liang also has a reputation for gouging people's eyes, but that's from the Jake Matthews guillotine. He just stuck his fingers in his face and just raked him off. But Xing Liang's actually been doing pretty good work with his jab and his boxing. Beautiful sidekick against... Who was that? That was David Suwada. But throughout the entire fight, he just put pressure on him, boxed him up, and then he finished it with a lovely sidekick. His boxing, when it's on, looks really good. And he beat up Zaleski. Zaleski, who I was super hot on. He'd looked amazing. And then Zaleski just showed that he didn't know how to box when he fought Li Jiangliang. I think if Ponzinibbio comes back anywhere close to the form he left in, the Leech has got a tough night in store. Especially when you consider how well Neil Magny's jab worked against him. This is just a very jab-heavy episode. People who are tuning in for the first time are going to be like, does he ever talk about anything except with a jab? Nope, jabs and low kicks, that's all we do here. and mispronounce fighters' names. Joaquin Buckley's back against Alessio Di Chirico. Bit of a softball for Buckley here, it looks like, because I mean he scored that amazing knockout against Impa Kasangane. I mean, you won't remember the name, but you'll remember the knockout. There was the jumping back kick off one leg. And they knocked out Jordan Wright in this next one, who was undefeated at the time. But now he's in against Alessio Di Chirico, who is 12-5, and he lost his last 3, hasn't won since a split decision in 2018. And before that, his last win was the Bang Bus, Oluwasi Bangbose. Yeah, I mean, this is a weird fight. I can't see any cancellation written here, so I'm not sure why they made it, but it looks like they're just teeing up a win for Buckley. I think they're trying to make him a bit of a star, but we all saw that Holland fight, so we're all a bit like, But power to him. I mean, get another nice knockout, and then you got 3 in a row. That's all it took for Jorge Masvidal, but to become the biggest star in the UFC overnight. Then you got a really weird one that I have my eye on, which is Dusko Todorovic versus Punahele Soriano. Soriano versus Todorovic. That's what we're going to call it from now on. A few people asked me about this one because it's a strange one to have start the card, and you've got these 2 very exciting prospects. I'm not going to say like Max Holloway, Conor McGregor matchup, but you know what I mean when I say that sort of thing, where I could see both these guys going on to do better things, but having had this fight back here. But no, good. I don't want to see people just fight people they're supposed to blow over. I like this sort of fight. It's just the lack of fanfare, which I suppose is a little bit weird. But then, this is what happens when you put 3 events in a row, when you do like the International Fight Week or whatever. Things get swept aside or get overlooked until one of them is like the knockout of the night. Todorovic is everything I like in a fighter. He has a weird bouncy karate stance. He comes in over long ranges. He likes his lead leg high kicks. But then he'll get to the inside and he'll push people to the fence and use a head post and then break off with combination punching. And he uses lots of cross counters to get inside to, right hand across the top of the jab. Just lovely all round. Whereas Soriano is exactly the kind of fighter that I like because they're just chaotic. He's the kind of guy who you put in against a great prospect and then he wildly swats at them with like southpaw left swings coming in parallel to the ground and goes fuck your hype and knocks you out. So it's a really compelling little matchup. Like even Soriano, even in his last one against Oscar Piota, he didn't look great until he did. he's cracking Piota with the odd counter swing, ends up on the bottom of the mat, scrambles out, gets up, twats him with a left hand and knocks him out. Whereas every second of Todorovic's last one was controlled by him. But yeah, he's the kind of guy who does a lot of like moving his head, a lot of pulling away from punches. So and again, the kind of guy who likes a cross counter, likes to lean in for one big counter shot. I could see him bouncing this guy's head around and then getting caught in the aftermath of that. Like he lands a really solid punch. The other guy slaps him with his eyes closed just because he comes back with the counter and knocks him out. That sort of thing happens a lot. So I could see that happening because Soriano, from what I saw of him, he's got a head like a brick. So yeah, that's pretty good. What else we got going? I mean, not an awful lot else you need to be excited about. I mean, Omari Agmedov versus Tom Breeze was on the card, and that was in there for like technically good but not at all hyped fighters. 2 of them against each other. I mean, Breeze had some hype, but then he lost and then he disappeared for a long time. And Omari Agmedov does consistently well, but not well enough or interestingly enough that anyone cares. So, but then the fight got cancelled. I think someone got COVID or tested positive for COVID. At any rate, we've got audiences back for this one apparently, so that'll be fun. So the second reading series that I wanted to do today is an article on MMA fighting by Stephen Morocco, which apparently he's been writing for a long time and just hasn't been able to get out. It's called The Cost of Being the King, and it's about Spencer Fisher, who was the Kingfisher. I highly recommend you read this whole thing. It's on MMA fighting. It's a fantastic article, and it's a tough read. It's a guy who was a big deal in the sport and got to a very high level and is now suffering from very severe symptoms of what is most likely CTE, but So CTE, it's kind of complicated because you can only actually diagnose it or prove it by autopsy, by actually looking at someone's brain. So confirmed, you can't confirm someone for CTE while they're alive, basically. But you can say these symptoms are consistent with CTE, which is, the list of symptoms here is one you'll have heard before if you're up on this stuff. It's one of those pieces that brings up that old duality of being a fight fan, where you love watching these guys have wars, you love watching knockouts, but you're also very aware that there are actual consequences to this. It's strange because there used to be people who argued there weren't. It's the same as football. They did the very best they could to try and pretend that there weren't concussions, or there were no, there's no negative hangover from a concussion. It's just, you get dinged up and then you walk it off and you move on. To jump halfway into the article, the meclizine treats Spencer's vertigo. Then there's memetin to enhance his cognition, Adderall for concentration, ezopiclone for insomnia, cariprazine for mania and depression, Ambien for sleep, downers in the evening and uppers to getting going in the morning. He is used to coping though, no matter what. His wife Emily says, one thing if you look at him, look at his cheek, it's atrophied. That's definitely been getting worse. If he's on his medication, he talks too fast, and then there's times where he talks too slow, and he'll drool and spit a lot when he's teaching. He doesn't do it all the time. Yesterday, when you came in, he started to get anxious, and when he gets anxious, his symptoms seem to flare up, and he gets off balance. It's heart-rending stuff. In this article where Morocco goes to see him, he starts making his daughter a sandwich and has to stop halfway through because he's frustrating himself and getting dizzy. His wife recounts him pulling over the car on the way home from teaching a session. He'd just kind of black out and have like a slight convulsion. It wasn't epilepsy, but it was a convulsion. I've seen him do it a couple of times where his eyes are open. She freezes her face and flutters her eyes, just kind of gone. I just sit there and shake him to get him to come back, and he always starts sweating afterwards. But this article it's a big piece, and it covers Spencer's rise and how he gets into MMA, and so much of it is so familiar. If you were around martial arts in like the 90s and 2000s, you're either rabidly pro-Gracie or rabidly anti-Gracie. You're trying to work out what works. You're trying to say like, oh, well, they didn't fight the best, Taekwondo or karate or whoever. Or you're going, I'm going to learn this jiu-jitsu and then I'll be able to beat everyone. And he worships Rickson Gracie and he gets jiu-jitsu lessons. He goes to train with the Miletich team, and every story you ever hear about the Miletich team is that they're just psychos. I mean, Miletich has had a very interesting week anyway as a person, but they trained, they sparred very hard back in the day, and they made great fighters and champions out of there. So there's, you will make great fighters through hard sparring. It's not really like a debate on that, but the effects of it are this long-term stuff. Quick quote from the article here. When he first arrives at the gym, two of the gym's most decorated fighters, founder Pat Miletich and Jens Pulver, competed to see who could drop Spencer first on his first day at the gym. Both lost. But the really disturbing part of this article is that firstly, Spencer Fisher was receiving payment from the UFC in his retirement from the sport. He had to pull out of a fight because he had issues on a brain scan, and then was just never back in the cage. And he'd been getting a payment from the UFC, and he couldn't speak out about his experiences because you don't want to lose the money. And then when he did lose the money, he held off for a while and then eventually let Morocco publish this piece. But throughout this piece, you get a recap of Spencer's career. And if you were watching TUF, that sort of time, he's coming up. He's legitimately a star for the promotion. Dana White is saying how much Spencer Fisher is like one of his favourite fighters and how more fighters should try and be like him. That everyone understands that you can get, or now understands that you can get brain damage fighting. I mean, it's been pretty well known in boxing for quite a while. But if you just get knocked out a lot and you don't get to the big leagues, you will probably quit. That's just what happens. Or your family will say you are delusional, quit. Spencer Fisher is one of those guys who was in the position where he had every right to believe that he should be breaking through and making the big money soon. He was a star on their shows, and he was a reliable fan favourite. And for the most part, he was succeeding. But now he's broken and broke. And that's a really harsh reminder. And the UFC wasn't in the same financial situation then that it is now. But what they're doing for their fighters now is not amazing. I don't know how much they're doing behind the scenes, but if they were doing things they were very, very proud of, they'd be doing them up front. And, one of the reasons that they have all these locker room bonuses and things, and, in this very article, Spencer Fisher says that he didn't want to speak out because he didn't want to lose goodwill with the company. But at this point, the league was sold for $4 billion. There are like 500 fighters on contract at any time. Anyone who has 3 or 4 fights in the UFC, or is a fixture for them for quite a while, like Spencer Fisher was, should be, certainly now, in a position where they can comfortably buy a house and not have to worry about like their future healthcare costs. You should at least be able to pay for your healthcare. And that's the sort of stuff that, like, yes, we need a fighters union. I don't want to make this into like another rant about making a fighters union, but at some point these guys have got to realize that they are the product. They are also anyone who gets into like that. Well, the UFC are the ones providing the capital. They're the ones taking the risk. No, the person sacrificing their body and life is taking the risk, or at least equal to the people who are paying for the lights and the cameras. It's a very hard article, and again, this hasn't been a very upbeat little piece, me talking about it, but you should go and read it. The Cost of Being the King. I'll link it in the show description. Right, to be more upbeat, let's do a question this week. This is from Brent, who found the funniest way of sending me a question so far. He's from Tennessee, and he says that he demands I preview Boucher versus Rugrog. This will be extraordinarily difficult, given that you have exactly one MMA fight to review to prepare for this analysis, and that one fight was kind of gross in that Rugrog could have broken the guy's neck a couple of times and seemed too nice to do it. He also defended a Kimura by picking the guy up and slamming him out the other side, which is certainly not a technique I've learned in the gym, but ultimately I guess it did change the angle, so what do I know? And he says, number 2, I don't have a second demand, thank you for your work. Now, if you missed this fight has actually fallen through since I wrote this down. I was like, I'm going to talk about this fight, and I was super hyped for it. But since then, they've changed it, and I don't know why, because it was a really fun fight, actually. Rugrog is a Senegalese wrestler, I believe. Hold on. Yes, he's a Senegalese wrestler. If you've ever seen the Senegalese wrestlers, firstly, fucking huge, a lot of them. They're eating good stuff down there in Senegal, but they did an amazing... There used to be a series on the BBC called Last Man Standing where they went around the world doing like challenges with the local cultures. So, and they'd have like a mountain biker and a strong man and a cricketer or something like that. And they'd go to different places in the world. And like one week, it was actually like some Indonesian tribe had their own form of cricket. And the cricketer was like, oh, now's my time to shine. But they went to Senegal and they did some Senegalese wrestling. And it's badass. I mean, you can watch Senegalese wrestling on YouTube. There's loads of clips of it. But they are big fellas. And they slap the shit out of each other a lot of the time. Don't actually know the ins and outs of the rules and how it differs from various other forms of wrestling that we're all familiar with. But Rugrog, he caught on and he took a fight in where was it? Aries FC, that was it. And he managed. He finished the guy in the second round, but he was just picking this lad up like a sack of potatoes. The guy tries to Kimura him on the ground, and if you're going for the Kimura standing and you can lock the hands between the legs, you could try and flip the guy over like Daniel Cormier style. Minoa did it, kept trying to Kimura Quinton Jackson, and Quinton Jackson would keep popping his head out the side and picking Minoa up and throwing him on his head. This guy did that from the top of half guard. He just like stood up, picked the guy up and slammed him. He's an absolute nutter. And then he's doing like these weird jump, fake flying knees and coming in swinging. It's so funny. He's like Yoel Romero, but on half speed. In fact, basically, I've said this before, but if he were 125 pounds and just spazzed out the same way, people would be like, oh, technical perfection. Because there's a guy called Bokang Masinyane, who I think we talked about a couple of times before. He's basically the small equivalent of this. He's a South African wrestler, and he just spazzes out and suplexes people and runs at them. Well worth a watch. In fact, his last one, he head kicked the guy. And that was in one too. So, but basically, Rugrog was going to fight Boucher, and I thought that was quite interesting because you got like Hulk strength and good wrestling against a guy who has passable wrestling. He's decent in no-gi competition at wrestling, but he's not a wrestler. And how does the technique hold up against a big monster? Even though Boucher is a monster-sized man himself. And in addition to that, like we talked about this the other week, but Yuri Samosh had his first MMA fight and won. They booked him against some guy that you'd never heard of, and the guy was, the game is so different that Yuri Samosh, who is a good wrestler in no-gi, couldn't do anything. And I always think back to Marcelo Garcia. There was someone asking on Reddit the other day, who's the best fighter to never win an MMA fight? And it's probably Marcelo Garcia. The man was the pound-for-pound best grappler in the world, maybe ever. He would give up 100 pounds to guys and beat them consistently. And like he fights this Korean nobody, and because he gets the guys back and he can't finish the choke because the gloves are in the way and it's so easy to grab the gloves. And then he gasses out and gets boxed up. Unfortunately, we've been robbed of that, and they've given him Elaine Ngali, who is the most sus physique you've ever seen. One championship, I was going to do a reading series on those. There was a pair of articles, I think it was Victor Rodriguez from Bloody Elbow. He put out a pair of articles recently talking to one fighters who were happy to talk to him about one shady shit, and one will always threaten to sue you if you say anything bad about them and work for them, or have worked for them in the past. They desperately want to have it both ways. They want to tell people that they're going to do WADA testing, and then James Goyder tweets that out like, yes, they're definitely doing it, and Gary Tonner's like, I've not heard anything about it, and James Goyder's like, well, you better get used to it because you're going to be taking drug tests, and then they never did. But then they also want to put up videos on their YouTube called 1FC's 5 Riptest Fighters. I give Rugrog a much better chance against Ngali. Ngalani, what's his name? Fuck, hold on. Yeah, Ngalani. I give him a much better chance against Ngalani because I watched Ngalani get out-grappled by Ong Lashong, who is not a shit-hot grappler. But anyway, that will do us for today. If you want to send an email to the podcast, the new podcast email is jackslackpodcast@gmail.com. If you want to see what I'm writing at any time, fightprimer.com. And if you want to get in on all the extra content, including the history episodes, I plugged them earlier this week. We did the Boxer Rebellion, which was, I thought, interesting because a load of people in red turbans stormed the legation quarter of Beijing, and then people in red hats stormed the Capitol building in America. If you want to get in on that stuff, read all the extra tactical guides and articles and absolute masterclasses and advanced striking 2.0 and things like that, sign up to the Patreon. I'm your boy Jack Slack, and bugger my ass does it feel good to have some fights back. Cheers.